It is every parent's worst nightmare, a stranger, a gun, and your children gone in an instant. But what if the tears are a lie? What if the grieving mother isn't a victim at all, but the person who planned everything? Welcome back to the Echo Crime Stories channel. In today's video, I'll take you through the chilling timeline of the most evil mothers ever sentenced to life in prison. We'll begin with the mothers who convinced the world they were desperate victims, only for the truth to expose an unimaginable betrayal. Then we'll move through stories of obsession, mental illness, and greed, cases that force us to question how love can become control and how faith can turn into violence. By the end, you'll see how each of these women's choices led to the same tragic conclusion, that the most trusted role in a child's life can, in rare and horrifying moments, become the most dangerous one. Let's start in the quiet town of Union, South Carolina, in the fall of 1994. A young mother named Susan Smith appeared before national television cameras, pleading for the safe return of her two sons, 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alex. She said she had been stopped at a red light when a stranger with a gun forced his way into her car, ordered her out, and drove away with the boys still strapped in their seats. The story was heartbreaking and believable. News outlets ran the boys' photos on every channel, yellow ribbons and prayer vigils appeared across the state. Susan and her estranged husband, David Smith, wept together on camera, begging whoever had their children to bring them home. For 9 days, the nation shared their grief. But detectives began to notice details that didn't add up. Susan's description of the supposed carjacker was vague, and her emotional state during interviews shifted strangely from despair to detachment. Polygraph tests failed to confirm her story. Gradually the focus of the investigation turned from the mysterious kidnapper to the mother herself. While searching for a motive, investigators discovered that Susan had been involved in a relationship with a wealthy local man, Tom Finley. Finley had recently ended the affair, writing that he cared for her but did not want the responsibility of raising someone else's children. That letter arrived just days before the disappearance. To detectives, it provided the key to Susan's possible motive. Her own sons had become obstacles to the life she imagined. On the 9th day of the search, Sheriff Howard Wells confronted her gently with the inconsistencies in her account. When he told her, "We know there was no carjacker," the facade collapsed. Susan Smith confessed. There had been no armed man and no abduction. She had driven her car to the edge of a local lake, stepped out, released the brake, and watched as the vehicle rolled into the water with her children inside. Divers later recovered the car, confirming the unimaginable truth. While the country had prayed for a miracle, Susan Smith knew all along where her sons were. Her trial became one of the most watched of the decade. Prosecutors argued that she was cold and calculating, that she used a fabricated story of a black male carjacker to divert suspicion and exploit public sympathy. The defense countered with a history of depression, a suicide attempt, and years of sexual abuse by her stepfather, suggesting a woman whose mental state had collapsed under rejection and despair. The jury found her guilty on 2 counts of murder but chose to spare her life, sentencing her instead to life imprisonment. As of today, Susan Smith remains incarcerated in South Carolina. Her first opportunity for parole came after 30 years, sparking widespread public debate about forgiveness and accountability. The story of Susan Smith continues to stand as one of the most disturbing examples of maternal deception in American crime, proof that appearances can deceive, and that sympathy can sometimes hide a terrible truth. Our next story takes us to Springfield, Oregon, in May of 1983. A mother named Diane Downs drove frantically to a hospital emergency room late at night. Inside her car were her 3 children, all gravely wounded by gunfire. 7-year-old Cheryl was already dead. 8-year-old Christy and 3-year-old Danny clung to life as doctors rushed to save them. Diane herself had a single wound on her arm. When questioned, she told a horrifying story. She said that while driving on a dark rural road, a stranger with bushy hair flagged her down and demanded her car. When she refused, the man opened fire on her and the children before running into the night. It was the kind of story that should have drawn nothing but sympathy. But from the very beginning, investigators and hospital staff noticed something unsettling about Diane's behavior. While her children fought for their lives, she seemed composed, more irritated than devastated. One nurse remembered that Diane's main concern was not her dying children, but the whereabouts of a man named Robert Knickerbocker, a married lover she had been pursuing for months. Detectives soon learned that Diane's emotional instability had been visible long before that night. She was obsessed with Knickerbocker and had written pages in her diary about him, letters filled with longing and resentment toward anyone who stood in the way of their relationship. That included her own children. When questioned further, her story began to change. Her timeline didn't match the physical evidence, and her demeanor swung wildly from laughter to tears. The final public confirmation of that strangeness came when she reenacted the shooting for television, smiling and gesturing dramatically as she described the attack. Viewers and investigators alike felt something was very wrong. The police collected circumstantial evidence but still lacked a direct witness. That witness was lying in a hospital bed, fighting to recover from a stroke brought on by her injuries, Diane's daughter, Christy. After months of therapy, Christy began to speak again. Prosecutors built a gentle relationship with her, waiting until she was ready to answer one crucial question. When asked who shot her, the little girl whispered, "My mom." That single statement transformed the case. Christy's later testimony described how her mother had stopped the car, reached for a gun, and shot each of the children before wounding herself in the arm to stage a struggle. The motive was heartbreakingly simple. Diane believed that if her children were gone, her lover would finally accept her. Her trial in 1984 became one of the most sensational of its time. On the stand, Christy spoke quietly but firmly about what had happened, while her mother performed for the cameras, arriving to court pregnant with another man's child, an apparent attempt to portray herself as nurturing and misunderstood. The jury was not persuaded. They found Diane Downs guilty of murder, attempted murder, and assault, sentencing her to life in prison plus 50 years. 3 years later, she briefly escaped from custody but was recaptured after 10 days. Today, Diane Downs remains incarcerated, still claiming that the mysterious bushy-haired stranger was responsible. Her surviving children, Christy and Danny, were later adopted by the prosecutor who handled the case, and they built new lives far from the woman who tried to destroy them. The story of Diane Downs exposes a disturbing pattern that will appear again and again in these cases: a mother whose desire for love or validation outweighs her most basic instinct to protect. It's a pattern that blurs the line between emotional need and calculated cruelty. Our next case takes us to Clear Lake, Texas, a quiet suburb of Houston that once seemed the picture of the American dream. Andrea Yates was a former nurse and a full-time mother. Her husband, Rusty, worked as an engineer for NASA. Together they had 5 young children: Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and baby Mary. To neighbors, they appeared to be a loving, religious family devoted to one another. But inside the Yates home, Andrea was fighting a private war with her own mind. After the birth of her 4th child, Andrea suffered a severe mental breakdown. She was hospitalized multiple times for suicidal thoughts and diagnosed with postpartum psychosis, one of the most dangerous mental illnesses linked to childbirth. Doctors warned both her and Rusty that another pregnancy could trigger a catastrophic relapse. Despite those warnings, the couple had a 5th child. As predicted, Andrea's condition quickly deteriorated. She became withdrawn, overwhelmed, and consumed by religious delusions. She believed that she was a sinful mother who had failed her children and that Satan was working through her. Her mind twisted those thoughts into a single, horrifying conviction: that the only way to save her children's souls from eternal torment was to end their lives on earth. On the morning of June 20, 2001, Rusty left for work as usual, leaving Andrea alone with the children. In a matter of minutes, the unimaginable occurred. When she was finished, she picked up the phone, called 911, and said in a calm, flat voice, "I just killed my kids." Then she called her husband and told him simply, "It's time. I did it." Police arrived to find Andrea detached and expressionless, as though her mind had separated from reality. Her statement to detectives was coherent but chilling. She said she wanted to save her children from the devil. The case shocked the nation and divided public opinion. Was Andrea Yates an evil murderer, or a woman so ill that she no longer understood her own actions? At her first trial in 2002, prosecutors argued that she knew what she was doing was wrong because she had waited until her husband left and locked the door to prevent interference. They sought a life sentence. A psychiatrist for the state claimed she had gotten the idea to plead insanity from a television show, an argument that would later prove false. The jury found her guilty of capital murder, and she was sentenced to life in prison. But years later, it emerged that the psychiatrist's testimony about the television episode had been fabricated. No such episode existed. The mistake was enough to overturn the verdict and grant a new trial. In 2006, a new jury heard a clearer picture of her medical history and the severity of her psychosis. This time, they concluded that Andrea Yates was legally insane at the time of the killings. She was found not guilty by reason of insanity and sent to a secure psychiatric hospital instead of prison. Today, Andrea Yates remains in a state mental hospital in Texas. She lives a structured, quiet life of therapy and art. Every year she waives her right to a parole review, choosing to remain under medical care rather than seek release. Her case forever changed how American courts view postpartum mental illness. It forced both the public and the legal system to confront an uncomfortable question. When a mother kills her children, where does the line lie between madness and murder? In another part of Missouri, the world believed it was witnessing one of the most inspiring mother-daughter relationships imaginable. D.D. Blanchard and her young daughter Gypsy Rose were known throughout their community for their courage in the face of illness. They lived in a small pink house built for them by charity, surrounded by donations, gifts, and support from local groups. D.D. presented herself as a single mother fighting for her sick child, while Gypsy, frail and wheelchair-bound, seemed the embodiment of innocence and perseverance. Together they appeared to represent love and devotion at its purest. But the truth was something few could have imagined. Gypsy Rose was not sick at all. She had been made to believe she was by her own mother. D.D. had spent years fabricating medical conditions, leukemia, muscular dystrophy, seizures, asthma, and many others. She shaved Gypsy's head to mimic the effects of chemotherapy and convinced doctors to perform unnecessary procedures, including inserting feeding tubes and removing healthy glands. Whenever a physician questioned her claims, she moved to a new hospital or a new town. It was a textbook case of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a psychological disorder in which a caregiver harms or invents illnesses in someone under their care to gain attention and sympathy. As Gypsy grew older, she began to realize that her body did not match the story she had been told. She could walk, eat, and live normally, but every attempt to express the truth was met with punishment or manipulation. D.D. controlled every aspect of her daughter's life, keeping her isolated and dependent. The only escape Gypsy found was through the internet. In secret, she created social media accounts and eventually met a young man named Nicholas Gojon. Their relationship turned into a desperate plan for freedom. In June 2015, Gypsy let Nicholas into the house one night while her mother was asleep. Moments later, D.D. was dead. The pair fled to Wisconsin, posting a cryptic message on Facebook that led neighbors to alert police. When investigators found them, the truth began to unfold. Gypsy was seen walking on her own, perfectly healthy. The image stunned the nation. The so-called sick child had never been ill, she had been imprisoned by a lifetime of lies. The court faced an almost unprecedented dilemma. Gypsy had participated in a killing, but she was also a victim of long-term psychological and physical abuse. Prosecutors weighed the circumstances carefully, and Gypsy eventually pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison, with the possibility of parole. Her boyfriend, Nicholas, received a life sentence. Gypsy's release in 2023 reignited debate about guilt, survival, and justice. Many saw her as both a criminal and a symbol of resilience, a woman who did something unforgivable to escape something unimaginable. She has since spoken publicly about her experience, advocating for awareness of abuse and for reform in how the medical system identifies Munchausen by proxy. The story of D.D. and Gypsy Rose Blanchard forces a painful question. When the person meant to protect you is the one causing the harm, what choices are left? It blurs the line between victim and perpetrator, between mercy and accountability, and between love and control. In Lawrenceville, Georgia, a small apartment complex became the setting for one of the most heartbreaking child abuse cases in recent American history. 10-year-old Imani Moss lived there with her father, a man, and her stepmother, Tiffany. To neighbors, the family seemed quiet, even ordinary. They saw Imani playing outside sometimes and assumed life inside that home was normal. But what was happening behind the closed door of their apartment would later shock even the most seasoned investigators. Tiffany Moss had once worked as a preschool teacher. By all outward appearances, she was responsible and devoted. But her relationship with her stepdaughter was poisoned by resentment. Years earlier, Tiffany had been convicted of child cruelty against Imani and lost her job as a result. Instead of remorse, that experience hardened her feelings toward the child she blamed for her downfall. Over time, the punishment and neglect intensified. Imani was isolated in a bedroom, denied food, and treated as if she were invisible. Meanwhile, Tiffany's own 2 children were well fed and cared for. 4 months, Imani's condition worsened. She was slowly starved, her body weakened, and her spirit broke. Her father, a man, watched it happen and did nothing. By October of 2013, Imani weighed only 32 pounds, the average weight of a toddler. When her body finally gave out, instead of calling for help, Tiffany and a man attempted to conceal what they had done. They placed her remains in a metal trash can, tried to burn them, and left the can in a wooded area near their apartment. It was there that maintenance workers discovered it, uncovering a tragedy that would haunt the community for years to come. Police quickly connected the evidence to the Moss family. Faced with overwhelming proof, a man Moss agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. He pleaded guilty to felony murder and accepted a sentence of life in prison without parole in exchange for testifying against his wife. That left Tiffany to face trial alone. In 2019, she did something almost unheard of in a capital case. She chose to represent herself. She made no opening statement, called no witnesses, cross-examined no one, and offered no defense. Throughout the proceedings, she sat silently, showing no emotion, even as prosecutors presented graphic evidence of Imani's suffering. Jurors described the experience as surreal. They said it was as if she had already accepted her fate or no longer cared about the outcome. After less than 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found Tiffany Moss guilty on all counts, including malice murder. During sentencing, they again deliberated briefly before recommending the death penalty. She became the only woman on Georgia's death row. Today, Tiffany Moss remains in state custody, awaiting the final outcome of her sentence. Her husband will spend the rest of his life in prison. The story of Imani Moss serves as a grim reminder of how silence and inaction can be as deadly as cruelty itself. It also raises a haunting question: how could two adults live with such a secret for so long, and what turns a caregiver's heart to such indifference? The story of Lori Vallow Daybell begins like a picture of suburban faith and family. She was a former beauty pageant contestant and a devoted member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Friends and neighbors described her as vibrant, friendly, and deeply religious. She lived in Arizona with her 2 children, 17-year-old Caylee Ryan and 7-year-old JJ Vallow, a boy with special needs. Her husband, Charles Vallow, worked hard to provide for them. But in 2018, Lori's life took a dark and extraordinary turn when she met a man named Chad Daybell. Chad was a self-published author who wrote books about near-death experiences and the end of the world. He claimed to have visions and believed he could see into the spirit world. Lori was drawn to his ideas, and together they developed a belief system that blended religion, apocalyptic prophecy, and fantasy. They began to see themselves as chosen leaders who would prepare the 144,000 righteous survivors for the second coming. Among their most disturbing beliefs was that some people's bodies could be taken over by evil spirits, so-called zombies, and that the only way to save the soul trapped inside was to destroy the body. As Lori's attachment to Chad deepened, her relationships with her husband and family unraveled. In July 2019, Charles Vallow was shot and killed by Lori's brother, Alex Cox, during what Cox claimed was an act of self-defense. Investigators would later question that claim. Just 3 months after Charles's death, Chad's longtime wife, Tammy Daybell, died suddenly in her sleep. Her death was ruled natural, and no autopsy was performed. 2 weeks later, Lori and Chad flew to Hawaii and got married on the beach. They smiled in wedding photos while Lori's children were nowhere to be found. Family members began asking questions. When police conducted a welfare check at Lori's new home in Rexburg, Idaho, she claimed that the children were staying with friends. Those statements quickly proved false. When ordered by a court to produce the children, Lori refused. By then, public concern had grown into a nationwide search. Media outlets nicknamed her the Doomsday Mom, while Chad became the Doomsday Prophet. 4 months, both remained silent as speculation spread. The breakthrough came in June 2020, when investigators followed cell phone data linked to Lori's brother, Alex. It led them to Chad Daybell's property in Idaho. There, in the backyard, police uncovered 2 shallow graves. One contained the remains of Caylee Ryan, and the other, the remains of JJ Vallow. The discovery ended months of uncertainty and confirmed what many had feared. Lori and Chad were arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder and conspiracy. During her 2023 trial, prosecutors argued that Lori had used her warped religious beliefs to justify killing anyone who stood in the way of her new life with Chad. They said the so-called zombie explanation was nothing more than a story to excuse greed, lust, and control. The jury agreed. Lori Vallow Daybell was found guilty of the murders of her 2 children and of conspiring to murder Chad's wife, Tammy. She received 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Lori remains incarcerated in Idaho, while Chad awaits his own trial. The case of Lori Vallow Daybell is a sobering example of how faith, when twisted by delusion and manipulated by ego, can lead to devastating consequences. It asks us to confront an uncomfortable truth: how far can belief go before it becomes destruction, and how do ordinary people fall under its spell? In the age of social media, it's easy to create the image of a perfect life. A carefully chosen photo, a heartfelt caption, and a flood of sympathy can turn anyone into a hero online. For years, a young mother named Lacey Spears mastered that image. Through her blog, which she titled Garnett's Journey, and a constant stream of Facebook and Twitter updates, she presented herself as the devoted single mother of a little boy who never seemed to catch a break. She wrote about endless hospital stays, mysterious illnesses, and her constant fear of losing her son. To her thousands of followers, she was an inspiration, a warrior mom fighting for her child's life. But the truth behind her posts was darker than anyone imagined. From the time Garnett was a baby, Lacey claimed he suffered from chronic digestive issues that left him unable to eat normally. Doctors, trusting her reports, eventually inserted a feeding tube directly into his stomach. That tube gave Lacey full control over what went into her son's body, and it would become her weapon. Investigators later learned that Garnett's so-called illnesses were not natural. They were the result of deliberate poisoning. Lacey was secretly feeding him massive amounts of salt through his feeding tube, keeping him sick to maintain attention and sympathy from others. Over the years, Lacey moved frequently, changing doctors whenever they started asking too many questions. She fabricated medical histories and exaggerated symptoms, always staying one step ahead of discovery. By 2014, her control over Garnett's life and health had become absolute. In January of that year, she took him to a hospital in New York after another sudden seizure. At first, doctors treated it as a routine episode. But within days, Garnett's sodium levels spiked to fatal levels. No medical condition could explain it. The hospital staff grew suspicious. Security footage showed Lacey taking her son's feeding bag into a private bathroom twice. Each time she returned, Garnett's condition worsened dramatically. When police tested the feeding equipment, they found extraordinarily high concentrations of salt. Digital evidence from Lacey's phone and computer revealed dozens of internet searches about sodium poisoning and the effects of salt on the body. The case was no longer a mystery, it was murder. In court, prosecutors described Lacey Spears as a woman driven by a need for attention so powerful that she was willing to harm her child to get it. They argued that her social media posts were not the story of a devoted mother, but a public performance built on suffering that she created herself. The defense insisted she suffered from mental illness and claimed there was no direct proof that she had administered the salt. But the combination of video evidence, internet searches, and medical testimony convinced the jury otherwise. Lacey Spears was convicted of second-degree murder in 2015 and sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. The judge who sentenced her said it best: "Instead of nurturing your child, you subjected him to years of torment and pain." Today, she remains incarcerated in New York. Her case stands as one of the most disturbing examples of how the search for validation in the digital age can spiral into something deadly. It forces us to question how much of what we see online is real, and what darkness might hide behind a mother's carefully crafted posts. In the summer of 2008, the city of Orlando, Florida, became the center of one of the most infamous missing child cases in modern history. 2-year-old Caylee Anthony was last seen alive in June, but for an entire month, her disappearance went unreported. Her mother, 22-year-old Caylee Anthony, continued to live her life as though nothing had happened. She went to parties, spent nights with friends, and even entered a local nightclub contest. She told her parents that Caylee was spending time with a nanny named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, a woman who did not exist. Caylee also told friends that she was working at Universal Studios, another fabrication. When her parents began asking to see their granddaughter, Caylee always had an excuse. Finally, on July 15, her mother Cindy tracked down Caylee's abandoned car. The moment Cindy opened the trunk, she was hit by an unbearable odor. She called 911 in a panic, telling the dispatcher, "It smells like there's been a dead body in the car." That call marked the beginning of an investigation that would grip the entire nation. Detectives quickly discovered that nearly everything Caylee had said about her job, her nanny, and her daily life was false. They also found signs of decomposition and high levels of chloroform in her car trunk. Still, Caylee maintained that her daughter had been kidnapped by the nanny and that she was conducting her own search. Investigators were unconvinced, and media outlets began covering the story around the clock. For months, the public held out hope that Caylee would be found alive. That hope ended in December 2008, when utility workers discovered a small set of skeletal remains less than half a mile from the Anthony family home. Dental records confirmed they were Caylee's. Duct tape was found near the skull, suggesting suffocation. The focus turned fully to Caylee, and prosecutors charged her with first-degree murder. The 2011 trial became a cultural phenomenon, drawing comparisons to the O.J. Simpson case for its media saturation and public outrage. The prosecution argued that Caylee had killed her daughter because she wanted to reclaim the carefree lifestyle of her youth. They said she used chloroform to sedate Caylee and suffocated her with duct tape before dumping the body in the woods. They pointed to the lies, the partying, and the tattoos she got during the month her child was missing as evidence of guilt. The defense countered with an entirely different story. They claimed Caylee had accidentally drowned in the family pool and that Casey's father, George Anthony, helped cover up the death. They further alleged that George had abused Casey as a child, an accusation he denied. The defense admitted that Casey lied, but argued those lies were the behavior of a traumatized young woman conditioned to hide pain rather than face it. After 6 weeks of testimony and 11 hours of deliberation, the jury delivered a verdict that stunned the nation. Caylee Anthony was found not guilty of murder, manslaughter, and child abuse. She was convicted only on 4 counts of providing false information to law enforcement. Because she had already served time awaiting trial, she was released shortly afterward. The reaction was explosive. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, furious at what they saw as a miscarriage of justice. For many, the verdict felt like a betrayal of common sense and morality. To others, it was proof of how difficult it is to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt in cases built largely on circumstantial evidence. Caylee Anthony has lived a largely private life since her release, occasionally surfacing in interviews to maintain her innocence. To this day, public opinion remains divided. Some believe she got away with murder, others see her as the product of a deeply dysfunctional family tragedy that spiraled beyond control. The case of Caylee Anthony remains one of the most controversial in modern American law. It raises questions about media influence, the power of perception, and how a courtroom verdict can differ so sharply from the judgment of the public. In the quiet town of Pleasant Grove, Utah, a discovery in April 2014 revealed a horror that no one could have imagined. A man named Darren West was cleaning out the garage of the home he had once shared with his estranged wife, Megan Huntsman. He opened an old box, expecting to find baby clothes or keepsakes from their past. Instead, what he found would uncover one of the most chilling cases of hidden infanticide in American history. Inside the box were the remains of a newborn baby, carefully wrapped in plastic. Shocked, Darren called police. When investigators arrived and searched the garage further, they found 6 more boxes. Each one contained the body of a baby. All had been there for years, hidden in plain sight. For the community, it was unthinkable. Megan Huntsman had lived among them for more than a decade, raising 3 older daughters, smiling at neighbors, and living what seemed like an ordinary life. No one had suspected anything unusual. When confronted by police, Megan showed little emotion. She admitted, almost matter-of-factly, that between 1996 and 2006, she had secretly given birth to 7 babies in her home. She said she killed 6 of them immediately after birth, one after another, and that the 7th was stillborn. Her reason stunned investigators. She claimed she was addicted to drugs and didn't want to care for any more children. Her husband, who had been in and out of prison during those years, told police he never knew she had been pregnant. He believed she had simply gained and lost weight. The details of how she concealed her pregnancies were both simple and disturbing. She wore loose clothing, avoided medical care, and gave birth alone in the bathroom while her family slept or was away. Afterward, she would clean up the evidence, wrap the infant, and hide the body in a box, stacking them among old belongings in the garage. For 10 years, she lived with those boxes only a few feet from her car, as if they were forgotten decorations instead of her own children. In 2015, Megan Huntsman pleaded guilty to 6 counts of murder. Prosecutors said her calm, almost detached confession showed a complete absence of empathy. During sentencing, the judge described her actions as the most shocking and inexplicable crimes he had ever seen. She received 6 consecutive terms of 5 years to life in prison, effectively a life sentence. Her surviving daughters, who had lived in the same home for years, struggled to comprehend the truth. The community of Pleasant Grove was left haunted by the thought that no one had noticed anything wrong. There were no missing person reports, no signs of disturbance, and no cries for help. For many, that silence was as disturbing as the crimes themselves. Megan Huntsman's case stands apart from most others in this documentary. It wasn't driven by jealousy, greed, or religious delusion. It was driven by apathy, a chilling indifference that treated life and death as mere inconvenience. Her story forces us to ask how someone can hide that much darkness for so long, and how an ordinary neighborhood can overlook it. Across these stories, we have seen 10 women who each began with a role society reveres above all others, the mother, and ended in acts that shattered that image completely. Some were driven by jealousy, others by delusion or despair. A few lived in worlds warped by obsession, religion, or mental illness. But what connects them is the same betrayal, the transformation of care into cruelty, of protection into control. Susan Smith lied to a nation for love that never wanted her. Diane Downs chose obsession over her own children's lives. Andrea Yates lost herself to a sickness that erased the line between salvation and destruction. Diane and Rachel Staudte poisoned the very people who trusted them most. Blanchard built a prison out of pity, and her daughter broke free in the only way she believed she could. Tiffany Moss allowed hatred to erase her humanity. Vallow turned faith into fanaticism and convinced herself that murder was mercy. Lacey Spears used her son's suffering to build a digital following. Caylee Anthony lied until truth lost all meaning. And Huntsman's indifference left silence where 7 lives should have been. Each story reminds us that evil rarely announces itself with violence at first. It often hides behind smiles, photographs, and the everyday language of love. That's what makes these cases so haunting. They show how darkness can exist within what should be the safest bond on earth. When the trials ended, some of these women went to prison, others to hospitals, but the questions they leave behind remain. How does love turn into control? How much of a crime is born from choice, and how much from illness? Can a person who destroys their family ever understand the weight of what they've done? And perhaps the hardest question of all, if a mother, the symbol of life itself, can commit acts like these, what does that say about human nature? Tell me what you think. Were these women born evil, or did life, pain, and circumstance twist them into something unrecognizable? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because every answer will tell us a little more about how far we believe the human heart can fall.